Hello, everyone. We will be looking at the historiography of fairy tales from 1985 to present. First, we're going to look at our main objectives, identify the monographs that have shaped the historiography of fairy tales and their various arguments, critically analyze the monographs and how they advance the scholarship of fairy tales, discuss where the fairy tale scholarship is headed today and where it's at currently. Now, here are the various 6 books that we will be looking at and analyzing. You can pause the video here if you wish to look at them in a chronological order. First, we will look at Pamela Berger's The Goddess Obscure Transformation of the Grain Goddess. This is a contemporary social history of the 1985 and why people are very focused on religion, how has religion shaped people's aspects from pagan deities to Christian sainthood. Pamela Berger's main argument is that the grain goddess manifested itself throughout the ages, that rule of grain people kept her alive through various folk dramas, and that is presented in art history, psychology, anthropology, and various things to showcase these folk dramas that we will get into with fairy tales. Fairy tales in the ancient world, Graham Anderson is one of the first people to connect fairy tales to antiquity. With this, he uses a formulaic connection to Greek mythos or stories with the modern conceptions that we have of fairy tales, such as Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, and Sleeping Beauty. He uses this with stories like Cupid and Psyche, Ariadne, Atlanta, all of these things, and showcases that women were one of the main people telling stories, and this is where we get the term old wives' tale, that these people were just sitting around and doing this. Now, for Anderson, one of the things that he does is shed light on fairy tale motifs in ancient stories and how they connect to the modern day. Now, Ruth B. Bodenheimer does something different in the year 2009. She shifts her focus and challenges the notion that fairy tales were solely disseminated by rural agrarian people. She argues this is not the case. Fairy tales were told orally, but their dissemination and their increase within the culture, presenting this cultural history of fairy tales. She says that fairy tales were influential due to books and literate city people focusing on these fairy tales. She also separates fairy tales into various categories, such as rise and restoration fairy tales, to show how they influence the people and their ideas. And she also argues to make her point clear that fairy tales may have been presented as disintegrations of ancient myth, as remains of Paleolithic belief. However, it is inadequate to prove that they existed in the ancient or medieval world. And this is connected in this cultural history thread that we have shown. This connects with Jack Zipes' The Irresistible Fairy Tale, the cultural and social history of a genre. How have fairy tales focused on and helped and shaped social movements, ideas, the media, and things around him? In Jack Zipes' tale, or just his history of the fairy tale and shaping the culture, he notices that fairy tale retellings, such as the Snow Queen and Frozen and Snow White with Disney and all these things, fairy tales are getting evolved. Fairy tales are changing, but in that change, in this symbiotic relationship, fairy tales are changing the media and how they are presented. And in this, Jack focuses on the politics and social movements, that fairy tales themselves were, in a way, influencing the social movements of the civil rights movements of the 1960s. Various ones. You have the feminist movements, you have the civil rights movement, you have LGBTQIA movements. All these things led people to believe in the power of imagination, revolutionary transformations, political justice, and utopian hope. Now, these things have not been achieved, but this is showing that fairy tales are important to the social stratosphere that they are in, and that fairy tales were used to create this counterculture, this counter world to the reality of the storyteller and the people they were discussing. Now, in this idea of LGBTQ and gender history and gender movements coming in, we get Brog Lydia and Boyle Lompart's Contemporary Fairy Tales, Magic, Separating Gender and Genre. In this 30 essay collection, that is an amalgamation of various scholars and their ideas, they notice that fairy tales, and use fairy tales such as Trolls and Cinderella, again, and Beauty and Beauty and all these things, use fairy tales to define and redefine gender expectations and roles. They use interdisciplinary methods to study the influence and functions of fairy tales in the modern culture. This is broken up into 3 major parts that examine how the filmmaking industry, monsters, motifs, and the role of helpers have shaped the public's perception of fairy tales. One of the big things that they argue is that fairy tales, in their understanding and tellings, can deconstruct our cultural understanding of gender that takes us away from this just like stereotypical view of what is gender and what we define as gender protagonists and how they're evaluated amongst people. Now, and in this another cultural history, we have a cultural history of fairy tales in the Middle Ages. This is a cultural history and why the Middle Ages is important. It answers the big question: why are the fairy tales and the Middle Ages interconnected? Who wrote these fairy tales and what were their purposes? And how did the narrative fairy tales shape the Middle Ages? Now, one big thing that it focuses on is that it focuses on three main eras: 14th century Aristocratic women and their understanding and writing of fairy tales, 17th century Germany with its, or 19th century Germany with it, 17th century France with its understanding of aristocratic women, 19th century Germany with the Grimm brothers, and 20th century England with C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien writing these stories, and that it is used, fairy tales are using ethnohistory and identity and social politics and social understanding to shape a conceptualization of fairy tales that impacts every aspect of all these lives. And now, fairy tales and why they're connected with the Middle Ages is that it romanticizes and look back on this enchanted past to birth the understanding of our phrasing of once upon a time. Now, where do we go from here? What is the state of fairy tale scholarship? In the 1980s, we look at the development of how Christianity shaped how peasants told stories, and these stories developed into folk dramas passed down from generation to generation. In the early 2000s, stories that we call fairy tales look at how their roots are in antiquity. In the late 2000s, fairy tales were told by city people. In the 2010s, we look at how culture is shaping based on the values of the current culture. And 2020 to present, fairy tales and retellings are redefining how we discuss gender within the culture by updating fairy tales for a new audience. Fairy tales become inseparable from the culture surrounding it. And this is the bibliography that it is. And thank you so much for listening. Have a good day.